Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Laura Shrake. I am the Senior Program Director of Business and Sustainability with the Council of the Great Lakes Region. It is a pleasure to welcome you today. Thank you so much for joining us. I am stepping in today for Mark Fisher, the Council's President and CEO, who also helped co-author the Sustainable Great Lakes report that we'll hear about today. Unfortunately, due to some connectivity and technical issues, Mark is not able to join us as planned. So I will do my best to fill his shoes for the next 45 minutes or so. During today's webinar, we will get a breakdown of the report titled Sustainable Great Lakes, a regional assessment of sustainability in the Binational Great Lakes Megaregion. We'll hear from the report's lead author, Dr. Daniel Hornweg, and get insight into the biophysical and socioeconomic indicators that were used to establish the reporting framework. But before I introduce our expert speaker, I want to help paint a picture of this mega region that we are talking about and share some important figures with you, highlighting the significance of the Great Lakes region. The Great Lakes are the largest freshwater system in the world and contain 20% of Earth's surface freshwater. It sustains life for thousands of species and provides drinking water for over 40 million Americans and Canadians. The region, which spans across 8 US states and 2 Canadian provinces, is home to 107 million people, provides 51 million jobs, and accounts for roughly 50% of all US-Canada bilateral border trade. If the Great Lakes region were its own country, it would be the 3rd largest economy in the world. So with those statistics alone, it's no wonder that the Great Lakes region, this mega region, is referred to as the economic engine of North America. Now, some of you may already be familiar with some of those figures, but I think they are important to revisit because they really emphasize the environmental and economic significance of this region. With a relatively stable climate, rich farmland, and 20% of the world's surface freshwater, people, companies, and investors are seeing opportunity in the Great Lakes. As people migrate as a result of climate change and climate disasters, more people will be moving into this region. But despite being dubbed a climate refuge, the region is under pressure with the climate crisis and environmental stresses increasing. So we need to safeguard the sustainability of this mega region that holds so much environmental and economic significance, which is why the proposed sustainability framework put forward in the Sustainable Great Lakes report, today's webinar topic, is important to bring attention to. Through the Great Lakes Economic Forum and sector dialogues like today's webinar, the Council of the Great Lakes region is playing its part to ensure knowledge sharing and coordinated action is taking place across borders and across sectors to really help position the Great Lakes region as a model for the rest of the world. For those of you who may not be familiar yet with the Council of the Great Lakes region, we are a binational nonprofit organization that brings together leaders of all levels of government, business, academia, and the nonprofit sector to strengthen the region's long-term competitiveness and sustainability. The council was formed to think strategically about the Great Lakes as a shared region and connects diverse interests and perspectives through dialogues to foster region-wide communities of interest and act on common regional challenges. So connecting global and regional thought leadership and addressing important topics like sustainable development allows us to align synergies and best practice to solve real problems facing the binational Great Lakes region and the world. So today, we will hear from our expert speaker, Dr. Daniel Hornweg, about a new sustainability framework that's put forward in the report using biophysical and socioeconomic indicators to establish a baseline for sustainability at the regional and city level, which can support governments as well as private sector investors to assess and compare sustainability impact of physical infrastructure and systems. We will have a brief Q&A session following the presentation. So If you have any questions at any time throughout the presentation, please type them in the Zoom Q&A box. I ask that you use the Q&A box instead of the chat box to help keep it easy for us to navigate the questions as they can't come in. And we will do our best to address as many questions as we have time for. So now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our expert speaker, Dr. Daniel Hoornweg. Dan is Associate Professor and Associate Dean at Ontario Tech University. For almost 20 years, Dan was with the World Bank, including as lead advisor overseeing sustainable cities and climate change programs. And he was the Chief Safety and Risk Officer for the province of Ontario from 2012 to 2020. Dan is a fellow with Canada's Transition Accelerator and the Global Cities Institute at University of Toronto, and he chairs the region of Durham's Roundtable on Climate Change. Dan researches energy and material flows of cities and urban systems, and he is also lead author to the Sustainable Great Lakes report that we will hear about today. So Dan, thank you so much for being here with us. I will now hand the stage over to you.
Great, thank you. Assuming you can see this and hear this. Thank you all for coming. And I'm going to try and convince you today, although Mark's not here, I'm going to try and give you the pitch that really the Great Lakes region is probably the most important region in the world. And it is sort of the end, well, not sort of, it is the engine of North America's economy. And arguably, it should also be the engine of sustainability for North America and for the rest of the world. So this report that we wrote, it's available online. So I won't get into the nitty gritty. You can download it, read it at your leisure. But what it is an attempt to measure the overall sustainability of the Great Lakes Megaregion, which, as you heard from Laura, would be the third largest country in the world, but to do so with a methodology that's consistent, whether it's a small county in Ohio, or if it's a small a city in Ontario, up to a province or a state, up to the megaregion, and that it uses a common approach that could be used around the world, and that was one of our key objectives. So yeah, so the report, it's available, and what it tries to do is to grapple with what I would argue are sort of the three big, well, actually it's only two, the two big trends that are driving pretty well everything in the world from an economic and a sustainability perspective, and it's arguably urbanization and demographics. So urbanization, the world hit that magic inflection point around 2008, where 50% of the world lives in cities. In Canada and the US, it was closer to 1922, somewhere around there, that both countries hit the 50% urban mark. And the last region, Africa, will be 50% urban sometime between 2050 and 2060. And it is cities and urbanization that drive our economies and create most of our pollution problems. And nowhere do we see that better than in the Great Lakes megaregion. The other big issue, and this you could probably trace this to the war in Ukraine at the moment, to the challenges between China and India, North Korea, is this whole issue of demographics. So Russia, the population is declining very fast, so you end up with all sorts of problems with economic stagnation. My students in the first day of class, they really don't believe me when I tell them that during their careers, the world cities are going to double in population, and that 80% of all the money made from now until the end of this century will not be made in the traditional rich country club, the OECD, US, Canada, Japan, Europe, but it'll be in mostly Asia and then Africa. And then the third big driver is information And what those are the whole digital economy, what those are resulting in is degradation of biosystems, loss of biodiversity. Climate change is the biggie, and it's probably the first really wicked problem that the world has had to deal with. And we're not doing so well just yet. So anyways, just a quick sort of summary of the Great Lakes and why the history of the Great Lakes region is so fascinating to me anyway. So it was all more or less decided that 1893 Chicago World's Fair, we had Nikola Tesla and Westinghouse on one side up against Edison. Edison was the guy who wanted DC electricity because he had all the patents for his light bulbs, and it was Tesla and Westinghouse that said, no, we think AC is better. And it was the Chicago World's Fair that made the decision and awarded the contest to Westinghouse and Tesla, and really the rest is history. The Niagara River, because of geomorphology and just the amount of water from the Great Lakes system, was enough to power the industrialization of all of the US and all of Canada pretty well at the start of the 19th century, 20th century, sorry. And there was lots and lots of electricity. So we had a whole pile of industrialization along the Niagara River. That's why we had, it's where, you know, the whole automotive industry was built along Detroit, Oshawa, Windsor, because of cheap electricity. And then once we had all those cars, then we started building highways. Then we came up with this whole concept of suburbia. That was all sort of driven to build more stuff because we had cheap power. The Great Lakes region are also one of the best examples in the world that shows you how, the impact of infrastructure. So the Erie Canal, not much in use anymore, but just by building the Erie Canal, connecting Lake Erie to basically to New York City, changed the fundamental development of the US and shifted the locus of power from Philadelphia to New York. And then we had the St. Lawrence Seaway later on. The power grid that we have today for electricity, it was all grown out of the Great Lakes region. The interstate and the 400 series highways in both countries, that all grew out of the Great Lakes region, and then grew to the rest of the world, really. Another important part of the Great Lakes is that it's only two countries, and fortunately the two countries get along fairly well, usually, but it created these things like the International Joint Commission, and we would not have had the development of the electricity system along the Niagara River if we didn't have the IJC and an agreement on sharing water resources. So the government of Canada felt sufficiently secure that the US would uphold its agreement, and same with the US. And so both countries built massive hydroelectric power stations because they believed the other country would let them, and they both benefited from that. That was really important. And then that grew into developing a shared power grid. It is the largest shared power grid in the world. And then we get into cross-border shipping, just-in-time manufacturing, the whole automotive industry, all got its start in the Great Lakes region. Then the other big thing was this, the ecosystem of the Great Lakes. You know, pollution doesn't really know what a border is. The fish don't swim only in the US side, or air pollution doesn't just stick to Canada or whatever. So it was really difficult, it is really difficult to come to an agreement on how you share something as big and valuable as the Great Lakes. So we had this development of the US EPA. Environment Canada was created 1 year after the US EPA, mostly developed because of Great Lakes, threatened species. Earth Day, it was joint between Michigan and California, were the two states that drove Earth Day, but I think it really was more Michigan than California, but don't say that if you go to California. And then we also see in the Great Lakes this whole, even though there's such a large ecosystem, just this concept of unintended consequences. So we still have an enormous amount of dioxin, for example, in Love Canal, Hyde Park, on the Canadian side as well. We had sea lamprey that were brought in by accident when the St. Lawrence Seaway was opened up. We had the burning, I think it was the third time that the Cuyahoga River caught on fire that really led to Earth Day and Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement that's now 50 years this year, I think. We had a funeral for Lake Erie, was a big driver of Earth Day. And then acid rain. Canadians were really upset with the US because the US was generating way more acid rain than Canada. It was one of the few things that we could blame the US more. And there was a political agreement that was developed. So basically the two countries learned how to get along because it was in both countries' interest because the Great Lakes were so important. So the sustainability of the Great Lakes or the sustainability of the planet or a country or whatever, it's not an easy thing to measure, obviously. This is the sort of every sustainable development student sees this. This is the original Rockstrom from the Stockholm Environment Institute, planetary boundaries. And those are mostly the biophysical constraints. So climate change, biodiversity, ozone, water. These are the sort of the things where there is a limit to just how much we can push the planet. And this has been updated by Stefan et al. And now we are actually, we've crossed 5 planetary boundaries, we're told. And then we also have the issue of sustainability of ecosystems and biophysical systems isn't enough if we don't have sustainable economies, sustainable societies as well. And that was really what drove the Sustainable Development Goals. And you probably all are aware of those 17 goals, 231 metrics. They were developed after the Millennium Development Goals, which we didn't achieve a single one of the Millennium Development Goals. We might achieve partially two out of the 17 SDGs. The SDGs are supposed to be delivered by 2030. You probably won't be surprised to hear that it's going to be an abysmal accomplishment in terms of how close we get. But anyways, the Sustainable Development Goals are really important because they started to give a voice to how all the pieces fit together, how economy fits with gender, fits with equity, fits with climate change, et cetera, et cetera. And so those are the sort of the core of how we measure sustainability in the Great Lakes, biophysical and socioeconomic. Now just to take a sort of a detailed snapshot at one of the biophysical, but probably the one that gets the most attention of late is climate change. And now this slide is a bit old, 15-year-old data. You can tell it's old because Canada, sadly, we actually surpassed the US in terms of per capita greenhouse gas emissions. But the issue about this slide that I think is really important is the sheer enormity of the inequity of climate change from a mitigation perspective. And if you look at that pie in the middle, that 2.5% is more than a third of the world's population. So about 3 billion people, 2.7 billion people in low-income countries do not generate more than 3% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see on the right-hand side, the Ethiopia, Tanzania, Bangladesh, Sudan, Nigeria, they are the countries that are going to be impacted the first and the most severe from climate change. They already are. And it is the countries, the Canadas, the United States, that have the lion's share of responsibility. And that is a perfect recipe for global dissent and angst. And I just love this picture. I mean, it's kind of a sad picture, but this is Betu. This picture is now two or 3 years old. Betu in this picture is 13-year-old boy, Beira, Mozambique, Betu was taken out of school because so was his sister Anina. They could not afford the money for school uniforms and books. Betu is selling oranges. He sells three. Just let me check my numbers. Yeah, he sells 5 oranges a day, and he makes 10 cents per orange on a good day. So it pays to take a child out of school in the world today to sell oranges and make 50 cents a day. So that's sort of in your mind of what we're talking about in terms of cost. Now, Betu lives in Beira, Mozambique. You may have heard of Beira, Mozambique, because the city was pretty well leveled twice by typhoons in 2019 and 2021. Huge, very powerful typhoons, arguably some of the first in the southern hemisphere that you can trace directly to climate change, that destroyed the city. So here's a child, and there's about 400 million Betus in the world, kids who are too poor to be in school, who's being taken out of school. So he's got nothing to lose, really. Betu's really quite smart, and so is his sister. I think his sister's smarter, but of course Betu's in the picture. They both wanted to be engineers. Maybe they're not that smart. But anyway, so they're taken out of school, and they have no education and they have nothing to lose now. There's 400 million of them in the world, and they're going to get angrier and angrier with the issue of climate change. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that that foments a lot of global unrest, and it's out there and it's growing. So let's take another look at what I would argue, well, is another wicked problem. One that should be much easier to address than climate change, this whole COVID issue. What are the emerging lessons from COVID? Not surprisingly, they're very similar to climate change. It's largely geopolitical problems. You know, everybody grumbled about the WHO. We have the US and China. We have high income countries and slow rollout of vaccines in places like Africa. We have countries and regions varied significantly in their response. The number of deaths per 100,000, it is not a measure of affluence. It's a measure of trust there's a great paper out last month by Lancet on what and how countries basically dropped the ball and who did well, who didn't, and it boils down to trust. We also learned that there are technological wonders out there. The mRNA development in the US especially saved millions and millions of lives and trillions of dollars in economy. We also saw and still see that much of the day-to-day work on something like on COVID falls to the cities. And there's often this grumbling between the city and the state, or between provinces. There's the border problem, closing borders, all this sort of thing. And we're also starting to see this issue, we call it the sort of insiders versus outsiders. Anti-vaxxers is a great, we have a lot of this stuff that gets complicated when science doesn't really drive the agenda all of the time. So back to the Great Lakes. I'm sure most of you have seen this very iconic figure that shows the threats and stresses on the Great Lakes and where they are. Of course, Ontario and Lake Erie, being smaller, are more threatened with greater population around them. Here's the University of Michigan, April 22nd, 1970, the first Earth Day. It was a big deal. It really was a big deal. There was a funeral for Lake Erie that was in every newspaper. People basically said, especially after the Cuyahoga River caught on fire, people said, for the love of, enough is enough. And there's still today, it's the single largest march on Washington, is Earth Day, and it made a big difference. This is a picture, a slide. I don't know how many of you were, the Council of the Great Lakes Region had a really good talk by Parag Khanna just a few months ago about his book Move. And what Parag Khanna is saying is that, hey, climate change is coming and it's going to have a huge impact, and is largely going to it's going to push populations that are in those red zones closer to the equator to the more temperate latitudes. And you can see where the Great Lakes are on here. This is definitely going to be an area where lots and lots of people want to move to. But obviously the Great Lakes are also very threatened. The Great Lakes are a vestigial water course. So it's like 99.3% of the water in the Great Lakes is not replenished by precipitation every year. So it's kind of like a souvenir group of lakes from the last ice age. So very fragile ecosystem, and we have lots and lots of pressure, people wanting to move into the region. Now, I'm sure none of you can actually see that, but these are the 2 pages. These are really the only 2 pages you need in the whole report, I think. The one on the left, the green one, is the biophysical indicators. 7 groups, so climate change, water consumption, and then we have socioeconomic indicators, a little more complicated, a few more indicators, but again, 7 broad areas: economy, equity, institutions, sort of a combination of the SDGs, the the planetary boundaries, and also the indicators. You may have heard of this group called the World Council on City Data, which is a sort of the keeper of ISO 37120, which is a global standard on city sustainability. And most of those indicators are on there. And maybe if there's time, we can come back to them and discuss them one by one if you want, or just go to the report. If there's any in there that you have questions on, just send them to me. Now, one of the things in here that's interesting is there are 7 indices, which are things like, Transparency International is an index of transparency by country. These are becoming more and more important around the world. Lots of good groups putting them together. Notre Dame is the best one out there, University of Notre Dame, for the resilience index. Most of the indexes out there are by country, but what we did was we downscaled them to cities. So so those sustainability indicators, we can do them. These are all the cities: Chicago, Detroit, Montreal, Toronto, the major cities within the Great Lakes region. And you can see where it gets red is where it's most out of whack in terms of sustainability. And then you lump all of those together, plus all of the populations outside of the cities for the whole Great Lakes region, and then you get the sustainability of the region. But obviously measuring sustainability is it's not easy. It's kind of like measuring an elephant, the elephant in a dark room, I guess, or the 5 blind men measuring the elephant. Probably the most important thing is consistency and transparency when measuring something like sustainability. A lot of people kind of come up with their own metrics so that they can then develop a website and then sell advertising or access to the website, that everything becomes proprietary pretty quickly, and then it lasts for 2 or 3 years and dies, or it becomes really big like a Google, and there's not that much in between. And so lots of this measuring of sustainability sort of comes and goes. There's probably no better example of measuring sustainability coming and going than McKinsey's famous marginal abatement cost curve for the cost of carbon mitigation or greenhouse gas overall mitigation. And McKinsey made a fortune on this cost curve. And what you can see is that everything below the line should be done. It's cost effective today. And then everything to the right, the further you go out, the more expensive it is per unit of carbon abated. There's some challenges, of course, with abatement cost curves because you can game them. You need to decide on what your time horizon is, and you have to be able to see how they influence each other. However, if you could come up with an abatement cost curve that was updated every year, and that was all of the inputs were publicly available and publicly that you could go in there and you could start messing around with the numbers so you could see how it would be impacted, that would take away a lot of the criticisms of cost curves. So it wasn't just that. That's McKinsey's famous one for the whole world. There's one that was done for the United States, the cost curve, this one out to 2030. Really a very powerful public policy tool that shows you priorities where to start. So once you measure the sustainability of a city or of a Great Lakes region, you can then come up with sustainability cost curves rather than just cost curves for carbon, which we did. They're in the report that will show you. And it looks at all 14 of the sustainability sectors, not just carbon mitigation, and is a better way of trying to combine and integrate public desire in terms of well-being and sustainability, and probably is the best way to improve overall efficiency of infrastructure, I would argue. So that's in the report. Generally, there are things like, what's a good example? So even without looking at this, we would know that pretty well if there's discussion about this hydrogen highway or low carbon highway from Chicago to Montreal. If you could develop that, we know that the degree of sustainability that would bring about relative to other infrastructure activities probably is enormous, because you would be replacing all of the fossil fuel combustion, but you would also be improving things like the economy and people being able to move around and all those other aspects that are hugely important for sustainability. Okay, so just to summarize, the sustainability of the Great Lakes, it really is the historical center of environmental awareness and rolling up one's sleeves and getting to work on meaningful action to reduce environmental impact. Obviously not there yet completely, but the Great Lakes between the US and Canada, the States and Quebec and Ontario really did spend the money, do the work, come up with cooperative cost-sharing arrangements to reduce environmental impacts. And that sort of spirit of doing really was replicated across both countries and around the world. There is a significant amount of degradation that's already happened to the Great Lakes. Fish stocks are barely what they were. Biodiversity loss, enormous. Lots of recovery. For example, the eutrophication of Lake Erie has been reduced, but it is not the most robust, healthiest ecosystem in the world. And it is going to undertake a bigger hit as we get into climate change and warming temperatures and greater populations. We heard, Laura had mentioned that the Great Lakes region would be the third largest country in the world if it was its own country. That gives it the political and economic heft to change the world. I mean, it really was the Great Lakes region that made AC electricity the standard around the world. it was Chicago's buildings that brought in the elevator, for example, and high rises. It has sufficient scale to develop industries, funding, the ability, really the ability to build out sustainability. Both, and if you do it in the Great Lakes region, you can do it around the world. And that is a really, I think, exciting thing about that you can't do. I don't think it's as easy to do if you just do it in a single country, because it's not nearly as replicable. If you do something in the US and then you go to Germany and say, hey, look, we did this in the US, the Germans are kind of, well, yeah, yay, you know, okay, we'll get around to it. But if you do something that works in both Canada and the US and does that really difficult bilateral, binational sharing, it becomes easier to replicate outside of North America. Climate change mitigation, big deal. Low carbon electricity, even though we have lots of coal still in Ohio and some of the states, we do have a relatively low carbon electricity grid in the Great Lakes region. We're very well poised to bring in hydrogen. You know, if there was regional support that we had sharing of a price on carbon, for example, that was consistent in the US states as it is with the Ontario or Canadian provinces, that would be a big deal. Similarly, if we had a price on travel, vehicle travel, so vehicle kilometers traveled, huge issue to drive the next big step of sustainability is we do have a lot of good experience in the US with tolling highways, for example, that if we got, you know, if every car had a GPS that was driving in the Great Lakes region and everybody was charged per distance traveled, it would fundamentally change the mobility structure. Climate change adaptation, we've got probably 50 million people headed towards the Great Lakes between now and the end of the century. Huge immigration pressures. Well, Mark Fisher, who's not here today, we're already seeing the challenges with adaptation and the electricity grid. We'll see that in food security. We saw that with the borders closing because of COVID. Water and electricity are going to be not harder to guarantee, but more susceptible to changing climate. And then food security is the other big issue. And then last slide for our sustainability priorities. Yeah, okay, I'm biased, but I do think that we won't get to sustainability if we don't just come up with a way to measure it and move on. Doesn't have to be rocket science. It just has to be a credible, globally consistent, and practical way to measure sustainability. Ideally, that it could just be on an app on your phone that tells you what is the energy and material flows in Chicago today, for example. That is sufficiently robust for people to start being aware of what's happening in their city, and that then drives public policy. We need to be prepared for unintended consequences, whether it's Asian carp or other impacts from climate. This whole regional partnership, they really are like a muscle. The more you learn how to get along with the state next to you, or the country next to you, or the county next to you, the more that can help you get along, I think, with countries outside of other countries. And then I think it would be wonderful if there was kind of an Earth Day 2.0 that grew out of the Great Lakes region again, that said, we're all in this together. By getting the Great Lakes region to greater sustainability, we can, work with the rest of the world to get there as well. So that's what the report tries to do, is to provide a platform that's simple enough, but sufficient enough to be able to measure where we are and where we want to go. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. It's such an interesting report, and I think this sustainability framework will be so useful to planners and decision makers. We have some questions that are already coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and just jump to it. The first one, you've touched on this a little bit already, but if you can just maybe elaborate a little bit more on why the Great Lakes region may be one of the best places in the world to quantify and build out sustainability.
Sure. Yeah. One, it's got the political heft. So if it's done as a group, two countries or more, it becomes more readily replicable. It has the money, it has the population, it has the scale. And without the Great Lakes, the economy in the whole area is significantly impacted. So it really has an impetus to try and protect the Great Lakes. So it's kind of where all the ingredients sort of come together the most convincingly anywhere that I know of in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you showed some examples from the report. Are there any cities in the Great Lakes region that are piloting this framework already?
We're starting with the region of York. We're going to try and come up with this real-time app for measuring sustainability, maybe with the city of Oshawa. That's where we are now. We have the initial framework done for Chicago, Detroit, Montreal, and Toronto.
Okay, that's great. And actually, that was one question I had was, is it possible, you mentioned a real-time app, is it possible to measure sustainability in real time or close to it?
I think so. I mean, I guess we'll see. Give us 6 months. But I would say yes, because we have a big component. So for example, there's 6 major electricity grids in the Great Lakes region, and 4 of them already have real time down to the last hour of the carbon intensity of the electricity and how much was used. We could do, that's probably the gold standard, but we could add vehicle, what is the traffic count on highways, what is based on the temperature, how much natural gas is used for heating, these sorts of things. We can come close. And I don't think it has to be hourly for sustainability. I would say the previous day or the previous week would probably be sufficient.
Okay, so we'll have to revisit this conversation in 6 months then.
Yes, so maybe if we could get it working, it would be great to do this again. Well, yeah, maybe more than 6 months, maybe, but no more than a year, sure. I promise.
All right, that sounds great. Another question that we have that's come in is what would be the highest priority for most effective actions? And this person writes, to me, the best activities are those that significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
I would agree. I'd say the first one would be integrated low carbon mobility for moving people, for one. So there should be, I think it's almost like an elevator in a building. You can just get in and you can go from the 2nd floor to the 10th floor or whatever. We should have a very similar transit structure on all of the interstate major highways, that it's easy to move around. We start feeling confident, and then you build out from that, so you don't need cars nearly as much. There's a great study out of California that just shows the benefit of that. And then also doing that, so probably moving to electric vehicles for personal mobility and buses, and then probably hydrogen for trucks. But if we said, somehow the 8 states, 2 provinces said, okay, we all agree that by, I don't know what, 2037, that all trucking on interstate highways will be carbon free. So it has to be hydrogen or something else. Move to hydrogen ferries and hydrogen shipping or ammonia on the Great Lakes. That would be one for sure. So I would agree. Get the other one would be, we have to get all of the electricity generated within the Great Lakes region below 100 grams per kilowatt hour. And we have to do that within, I'd say within 10 years. It's a big job. But those would be the two big priorities, I think.
Okay, that's interesting. Another question that's come in, and I'm not clear on this, so hopefully you will be. How does this compare to the Heinz Center's State of the Nation's Ecosystems, an indicator framework developed for the US?
Oh, great question. So that the challenge is most of the really good indicators are national, whether it's from the World Bank, or from Heinz Center, or from the Notre Dame risk index, climate risk. Most of those are at a country level. What we did was we've taken many of those and saw where we could adjust them to either a mega region or a city scale. So, for example, there's a really good example. The World Bank, the number one report that we had at the World Bank was the Ease of Doing Business report. And it was at a country level, and everybody got all bent out of shape and obsessed with how their country rated in terms of doing business. But all of the data was only one city. So in the US, the US was the one country that had two cities, New York and LA. But if you're in Chicago, you know that the difference between starting a business in Chicago is very different than New York or LA. So none of that was really captured adequately. It was all kind of lumped together. So a lot of the really good stuff, businesses, sustainability, I think is more telling or more fulsome at a city or a regional level than it is at a national level. However, all of our institutions and all of our money kind of goes to measuring at a national level. So it just gets so, the heterogeneity of national data is just enormous. So to say, per person in the US, it's, 18 tons per capita greenhouse gas emissions. Well, it varies from 6 to 33 probably, but there's one average number. So huge, valuable metric, but probably better done at a city or a regional level, or maybe even the state.
And that can carry us into this next question, which is, can the main cities be really effective without coordination with the authorities of the provinces in Canada and the states within the US?
In a word, yes. I think so. We live in a world where the structures of our governance, it's ever since the Magna Carta and the whole League of Nations and then the United Nations, we are a planet that is governed by countries. However, our economies, our well-being, our environmental pollution is driven by cities, but it's slightly bigger than a city. So it isn't the city of Toronto that matters, it's the greater Toronto area. It's Metro Chicago, it's all of Detroit, not just the city of Detroit, but the metropolitan area. Those are the sort of the locuses of genuine action in terms of economic building and environmental impacts. The issue would be to measure sustainability at the best scale, which is probably mega region or the GTA in Toronto or metropolitan Montreal, whatever, and then feed that into the public policy at the state level, the city level. Our utilities often are not contiguous with our cities anyways, and the carbon intensity of electricity or the reliability of electricity or natural gas, for example, huge impact to sustainability, and that isn't a state or a city. So it's figuring out a geographic area and then having it impact on all the other institutions and governments.
Yeah. Okay. We have regarding I guess some of the indicators. One question is about how the role of Indigenous peoples in the region and their concerns get addressed.
Good question. Not nearly well enough yet. The issue on sustainability. So some of these things are, so for example, planetary boundaries, climate change, water consumption, embodied water, biodiversity are indicators that are kind of uh, quantified. That they, you know, the 350 parts per million, the goal for 1.5 degree global warming is designed around not having a, you know, it's sort of like the Mayor LaGuardia said it best, you know, there's not a Democrat and a Republican way to pick up garbage. It's the design of these indicators is that they hopefully transcend the politics and hopefully capture, you know, issues that are important to everybody, but probably particularly to the Indigenous community, hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah, hopefully. I think we have time for one more, which looks like it is, I guess, more of a comment than a question, but I'll read it and see if you want to address it or have a comment. It's we need a plan for decommissioning old pipelines as we phase out fossil fuels and think about cleaning up these stranded assets. We also need to make sure we do not invest in new fossil fuel infrastructure going forward, simply to accommodate a desire for continued fossil fuel expansion by the industry. And we need to be very critical of using things like SMRs for meeting our climate goals, because the nuclear waste issue still has not been properly addressed, not even with the proposed DGRs around the world. So not really a question there, but I don't know if that's something that you want to address from the perspective of the framework.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. The issue, let's say, for example, let's take nuclear. Nuclear is a great, well, some people don't think it's a great example, but it's a really powerful example of trying to compare an apple to an orange. So if you are going to compare nuclear power to coal-fired electricity, usually up until now, there hasn't been a mechanism on how you do that. This platform, with trying to compare it at a broad sustainability level, is arguably a much more comprehensive and a better way to do it, so that the impact from nuclear waste is certainly measured and taken into account, but it's compared to the air pollution that's associated with coal-fired electricity, for example. Same with shipping oils by pipeline versus shipping it by train versus, you know, bringing it in from you know, Russia or Saudi Arabia or whatever. We need a tool where we can take out some of the, I was going to say take out some of the emotion, but that's not exactly what I mean, but to make it more more visible on where the trade-offs are and what we're counting for the trade-offs. So what do we give for jobs? Where do we worry about waste? These sorts of things. And I think you can't really, I mean, that's a great point about the challenges. I just think that, you know, you need a mechanism to try and compare all of those things. You know, renewables, it's good for this. Where are we going to get the, you know, the trace metals for the, et cetera, et cetera. We've done that mostly through the political sphere up until now, with lots and lots of influence from lobbyists, whether they're fossil fuel companies or whatever. We need I think, a more above board mechanism on getting into this debate and sort of knowing who's driving it and why.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. I agree. I'm going to go ahead and squeeze in just one more question, actually. And this is sort of connecting the global and the local. What's your assessment of the global sustainability agenda and why taking action locally and regionally is so important? So, for example, like there's so many global conferences and pledges, from Agenda 21 Summit to the Millennium Development Goals and now the Sustainable Development Goals. Is there still such a disconnect between the international ambition and local action?
Ooh, yes, there is that still that big a disconnect. Nobody wants to change. We all hate change, but we know we kind of have to do it. And so we use a lot of these. So, I was at Rio and then Rio plus 20. And, I've been to, I don't know, half a dozen COP meetings. And a lot of them are because the people who are in the countries, I don't think it's fair to say it's the countries, it's us in the countries, have not made the commitment yet to pay for the changes required or to do the things that need to be done to make the difference. So it's way easier to have a conference than to do some of the things that we know. But I think if you do it at both the local scale, because we're going to have to do it at the local scale, and it is getting out of fossil fuels and moving to heat pumps and electrifying everything, water treatment, etc., for around the Great Lakes, hugely important. But we also have to figure out how to get 50 cents a day to kids like Betu. That shouldn't be that hard. We've made it so complicated for a variety of reasons. And I think that an organization, however it's structured, but something with the heft of the Great Lakes region, has the ability to say, whether it's to the US EPA, to the United Nations, to Canada's Ministry of Environment, whatever, hey, this is important, this is what we want you to do, and we will do this, that it's creating that inertia for the change. And all politics is local and all change starts locally, but it isn't enough. It isn't enough for us to do it personally. I mean, the challenges are so big that, me driving an electric vehicle and having a super insulated house is not going to, it won't cut it. Even if I can get 100 people to do it, I need to get my city and then the Greater Toronto Area and then the Great Lakes region to do it. And once the Great Lakes region does it, then I think the world will do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan, thank you so much for breaking it down for us. I think this is such an important and useful framework that you've introduced in this paper. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions. But thank you for sharing your insight and diving into this approach with us today. I believe the link to the Sustainable Great Lakes report, yes, I see it's showing on the screen. It should be added into the chat box. If not already, it will be there soon for you to click on. I really recommend everyone visit the link and download the report. There's such really useful, interesting information in it. We would like to keep this conversation going. The next in-person Great Lakes Economic Forum will be held June 26th to 28th in Chicago. And we hope to see you there so we can continue these meaningful discussions. I do encourage you to register and attend. The link is also displayed on the screen and should also be included in the chat box. Also, in addition to next month's Great Lakes Economic Forum in person, the Council of the Great Lakes region is working to bring additional content and webinars as part of our virtual series. So please stay tuned. New events will be introduced this summer. And if you would like to get involved in the council's work or share any thoughts or ideas, please reach out to me or anyone from our team. We would love to hear from you. And that concludes today's webinar. Thank you and hope to see you in Chicago at the Great Lakes Economic Forum. Thank you, Dan.